I kicked myself and was like, why? Why did I not do that? That is just such an obvious thing to do. Why did I not do it? And I think the reason is because when I learnt PFLs, I learnt them in Assessment 172.
G'day everyone and welcome to episode 85 of the Flight Training Australia podcast, the podcast all about flight training and flying in Australia and beyond. I'm your host Trent Robinson. Thank you for joining me. How are you today? Hope you woke up bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, ready for another amazing week of aviating. I'm cold. I actually put on a jumper today. Darwin's dry season got off to a great start, then went backwards to almost a build up again for a short period, but is back as it should be, just perfect. Few exciting things happening. Firstly, you may have seen on my Instagram story, I am now officially a sponsor of a drift car. My son Flynn has been drifting with the Top End Drift Association up here in Darwin for a couple of years now since we got here. Saved up, got a Nissan 180SX, fairly stock. We've had a few things done to it, but we've been slowly chipping away. I know nothing about cars, so I've been learning all about that, how it all goes together, 12-volt battery systems, trying to change things, wire up new gauges, pull out bits and pieces, work out what's connected to what. Still some things to go, but the roll cage is in, high cast removed, lock bar in, new brakes, e-brake, everything else. Yeah, it's very cool. And if you've never seen drifting before, check it out. It is just the most fun, and especially when the two drivers are sitting there right next to each other, battling away, door on door action. It is really impressive stuff and deserves to be far more popular and well known than it is. So keep an eye out for that. I'll certainly be sharing more as the season continues. I'm also very excited to be starting some special training next week. I have been honoured with the opportunity to get my type rating on the Grumman Mallard, the amazing flying boat up here in Darwin with Pasquale Pearls, and a truly exciting chance to fly only 3 of their type in the world. There is a difference between the radial engine and the American turbine variant, but much more on that later. But needless to say, I will be heads down and bum up for a few weeks, but don't worry, I will have the podcast still coming out on Mondays as scheduled, and I will give you updates as things progress. Now, more recently in the news, and linking in with today's topic, there have been sadly some terrible accidents over the last month or so. The 310, 210s, there's helicopter, a couple of helicopter accidents, aircraft overrunning runways. It's just been terrible. Most have all been survived, not all. And I think it really ties in with what we're going to talk about today in today's interview. And that is that it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter how experienced you are. If something's going to happen, it's going to happen. And it's only our reaction and our handling of that is going to give us a chance to walk away and survive the incident. So while you're listening to this episode, I really want you to just sit back and take a stock a bit about how you go about your day-to-day flying, and for goodness sake, keep yourself safe and your passengers safe. And as I keep saying, I want to make sure that everyone goes home after the day's flying. It's meant to be a job. It's meant to be fun. It's meant to be an adventure, but it's not something that we're not meant to be going home from. And aviation is safe. It is incredibly safe, but we've got to make sure we keep it that way, and there's always opportunities to make it safer. All right, so my next guest has a very special story to share with us. Back in April of 2023, she had the harrowing experience of having to ditch an aeroplane off the coast in Perth in her Piper Archer. So to share that story with us and talk all about it, I'd like to welcome Michelle Yeates. Michelle, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks very much, Trent. Thanks for having me.
You are so welcome. And thank you again for volunteering to talk about this, because it is a very difficult subject to talk about, especially, if it's putting a bit of a spotlight on us on that. But there's so much out of this that can benefit people. And as I said to you when we talked, everyone sort of asks for stories of incidents and accidents and things, because that's the beautiful thing about aviation. We can all learn from it, can't we?
Yeah, definitely. I've learnt so much from listening to other pilots and talking to people about things they've done and things that have gone wrong. And yeah, it's absolutely important to all share these things and learn from each other.
Yeah, fantastic. All right. Well, before we get into that, would you like to just give us a little bit of background of what got you interested in flying in the first place?
Yeah, sure. So I grew up on a dairy farm in a little place called Shady Creek in Victoria, and never had any link to the aviation industry at all. Never even went on a plane until I was 18. Kids that grow up on dairy farms don't tend to go on big holidays. So didn't have anyone in the family who was a pilot, nothing. And I was quite interested when I listened to your interview with Bob Tate, because he said something similar. He said that he didn't have any aviation sort of history in his family either. And when I was 18, I got a scholarship with Rio Tinto, the mining company, and they flew me down to their aluminium smelter in Tasmania. And that was the very first flight I'd ever been on. I was 18. And I was like, wow, this is awesome. This is really cool. And then a couple of years later, I bought a trial introductory flight for myself and my dad. I think it was my dad's birthday. And we went to Moorabbin and did a trial introductory flight in a Cessna 172. And I was just like, oh, this is awesome. This is so cool. I definitely want to be a pilot, you know. But back in those days, and I don't know whether it was just that I didn't know or wasn't aware, but it seemed like getting your pilot license was very expensive, and it wasn't really the kind of thing you could do sort of straight out of school. I don't think that there was the VH-FEY help that there is these days for commercial pilots and that sort of thing, or if there was, I certainly wasn't aware of it. So when I finished high school, I was really interested in chemistry and physics and maths, so I decided to do engineering at uni. After the trial introductory flight, was really keen to fly, but didn't have the money for it. I was, putting myself through uni. Started working in the mining industry, got a job, as I said, with Rio Tinto. And so after a few years, I did have enough money to get a pilot license, but by that stage, I just didn't really have the time. I went and lived in America for a couple of years with my work, came back to Australia, lived in Paraburdoo, sort of, nowhere near somewhere where you could train and get a pilot license, got married, had a couple of kids, moved interstate multiple times. There was always something that was, taking up my time. And so it wasn't until a couple of years ago now, in 2020, in the middle of the COVID pandemic, I was offered a general manager role with BHP at Olympic Dam in South Australia. And my husband we decided that he would stay here in Perth with the kids while they finished off the school year, and I went off to Adelaide on my own. And of course, being the pandemic, Mark McGowan wouldn't let me back into WA. So I was literally over there for 6 months completely on my own. And I was like, right, now I've got the money and I've got all the time in the world because I don't have two kids to look after. So I went out to Parafield and I actually did a TIFF in a helicopter in a Robinson 44 because I was really keen to get a helicopter license. And, flying the helicopter, we sort of flew out to the training area and the instructor let me have a bit of a go. And it didn't seem that hard. It seemed like, it was reasonably easy. You could go up and down and around and that was all fine. But then we got back into the airport and he hovered above the helipad and he said to me, okay, I want you to hold the helicopter still over the helipad. And I was like, okay, cool. So he gives me control and I've got this little joystick and, you make the tiniest, slightest little movement and the chopper's just going all over the show. So I think I tried about 5 or 6 times. He kept saying, you have control. And then I'd lose it and I'd go, oh, you have control. And so I was sort of in the chopper that day. I got out and I thought, wow, that's way harder than I thought it was going to be. And I thought, I don't know if I can do that. So decided to go for fixed wing and get my airplane private pilot license instead. So I
very smart.
Yeah. Never know. One day I might still get a helicopter license, but for the moment I'm happy flying fixed wing planes. So I signed up with Aerostar and had this fantastic instructor named Matt Brooker. He was just absolutely awesome. He was so patient with me. And got my private pilot license. It took me about a year. I was working full time and just sort of flying on the weekends. And there was a period of about 5 or 6 weeks through the winter there where so it sort of took a while and eventually got my private pilot license. And I then started doing some flights. I think the very first flight I ever did, like the week after I got my license, I flew up to Maree in central South Australia into the designated remote area. I think the flight instructor and the school thought I was mad going up there for my first flight, but went up there with my dad. And anyway, I did a few flights and really enjoyed it, and found myself in a position where I just couldn't stop thinking about flying. I was just so preoccupied with it. I would dream about it when I went to sleep at night. I would be at work and I'd be looking up at the sky and thinking, oh, I wonder how high that cloud base is. Looks like about 3,000 feet. And the elevation of the aerodrome here is 1,000. Oh, yeah, I could get in there. And so I just literally spent time thinking about flying. And I thought, you know what, people sort of say if you can find something that you're really passionate about and you can do that as a job, if you can make a living from that, then you've got it made. You know, you don't really ever have to work. And I really enjoyed my jobs that I had in the mining. Like I got to see some amazing places. I lived in some amazing places and I enjoyed the work, but I wasn't necessarily passionate about it. And when I learned to fly, I was like, oh, I found it. You know, this is what I'm really, really passionate about. This is awesome. So I decided to quit VH-FEY and, I initially took a year off. They have a thing called a career break where it's a bit like parental leave. You can take a year off and you've got a guaranteed job at the same level when you go back. And I thought, well, that's a pretty low risk way to do it. I'll take a year off and just see what happens. I'll go and get my commercial license and see how I go. So then I only had about 90 hours of flying experience. I didn't have a lot. And obviously without doing an integrated CPL course, you need to get 200. So I thought, well, I could either pay lots and lots of money to hire aircraft off other people and get my 200 hours, or I could just buy my own plane. And, you know, having worked in mining for such a long time, I was pretty well set up. So I had the money to buy my own aircraft. So I was on planesales.com, you know, looking at planes and trying to work out what I wanted to get. And a Piper Archer came up for sale in Perth. And I had actually planned to go over to Melbourne the following week and look at a few different aircraft in rural Victoria and New South Wales. I had this trip planned. And then the aircraft came up for sale on the Saturday and I called the guy and I said, can I come and have a look at it tomorrow? He was like, yeah, sure. So I went out and had a look at it, this beautiful little Piper Archer, and had a look at the plane, took it for a circuit, you know, with the guy that was selling it. And I was just like, this is beautiful. I love this plane. This is so awesome. And I made him an offer like that day and bought the plane that weekend. I trip to Melbourne and never went to look at all the rest of them.
Wow. So you didn't even get anyone to look over it? It was just...
Well, I had a chat to the lamey who had been maintaining it at the Aero Club and sort of spoke to him about, you know, the maintenance history and what his thoughts were, and it was all very positive. And the guy I was buying it from, his name is Denby Comerford, lovely guy and really, really meticulous with everything. And I could tell that he'd really looked after it, you know, and he hadn't had it for a long time.
Yeah, nice.
But he was certainly somebody who I knew had taken great pride and great care in his aircraft. So I felt pretty confident after talking to him and talking to the lamey that this was going to be a good plane.
Yeah, cool. And then you finished your training in that?
Yeah, well, I went on some adventures. I was like, right, I've got to get 200 hours, so let's have some fun, you know. So my dad came over and we flew up to Kununurra, up through the Pilbara and across the Kimberley, and, you know, went and saw all the famous sites, Mitchell Falls and the Bungle Bungles and the horizontal waterfalls and all that stuff. And we had a great time, and I did 45 hours of flying in 10 days on our Kununurra trip. So that sort of notched it up a bit. And
beautiful.
Then went to Coral Bay with the kids and went to Exmouth with my mum and went down to Augusta and did some Aero Club trips out to the Wheat Belt and, you know, just sort of made the most of it, did as much sort of flying as I could. And then I went and signed up with Minnovation with Min Stokes and Tricia Hart, and they gave me my sort of CPL training, and I had to obviously fly a different plane for that because a Piper Archer doesn't have a retractable undercarriage or a CSU. So I did that in a Piper Dakota that Min had, and it was very, very similar to the Archer. So that made it super easy for me because I was so familiar by this stage with Piper aircraft, and flying the Dakota wasn't much different to mine. So did my CPL flight training with those guys, and then the day that I did my CPL flight test, went out over the Wheat Belt, and the assessor was very nice to me because I really didn't do very well at the lost procedure. I'm not from Western Australia. We got out into the Wheat Belt and he put the hood on me and got me lost. I was just, I was lost, and it didn't
objective, Matt. Yeah.
And it didn't look anything like that. I had studied Google Earth the night before, you know, because I knew kind of where he was going to do it. But the Google Earth photos were taken at the end of summer when everything is dry and all the lakes are dry. And we were out there in September and it had just rained and it looked so different. And I was just,
it does, doesn't it?
Anyway, so I got through it eventually, but he was very nice to me.
Well, it sounds like you did it. Like you did the lost procedure. I've always said we should call it the found procedure because it's really what you're trying to do, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I was sort of flying around and I kind of had an idea where I was, but not really. And then he very nicely sort of gestured me towards this town that I could see over in the distance, and there was an airstrip there, and I knew that was Quarantine as soon as I saw it because it was the only one out there with an airstrip. So then I was right after that.
Yeah.
He had to give me so,
all right. So I get asked this question a lot, and it's something I want to cover, and I understand this is not a researched question, but do you feel that owning an aircraft to train in was a cheaper option?
Yes, I do.
Given that you'd eventually sell the aeroplane so you can make money back and all that. But yeah, you think it's a good idea?
Yes, I definitely do think it was a cheaper option. I think when I added all up what I spent on maintenance, and I upgraded the transponder because it just had an old mode S, I think. When I upgraded the transponder and calculated what I paid for maintenance and fuel and landing fees, and it added it all up, I think it probably cost me about $150 to $170 an hour. And you can't hire an aircraft for that in Western Australia. So I definitely think it was a cheaper option. Had I then needed to sell the aircraft and had to sell it for a significant amount less than what I paid for it, it possibly wouldn't have worked out cheaper. But I didn't end up in that situation in the end.
No, we'll get to that. Yeah. No, that's right. But look, at the moment, aircraft are holding price, if not going up. It's quite ridiculous, some of the prices.
Yes,
people are asking for things at the moment. So
yeah.
Yeah, okay. Interesting.
So I got my CPL, and then I think I hold the record for the shortest period of time between getting my CPL and being offered my first CPL flying job. I shook hands with the assessor, Andrew Brain, and then I turned around and walked out the door, and literally 20 seconds after shaking hands and him telling me that I passed, Frank says to me, "Would you like a job?" And Frank's the owner of Rottnest Air Taxi, and he knew Min, and so they'd been talking about me and that I was getting my license, etc. And he was looking for a pilot. Yeah. So it took me literally 30 seconds from getting my license. So I was like, yes, this is the go.
Brilliant. Yep. Well, like I always tell everyone who's doing the commercial training that you're a walking resume.
Yes.
And people are watching, so put on a good show. And
yeah, very much. The networking thing is super important, and it's all. My dad always used to say, "It's not what you know, it's who you know," and he's spot on in this regard.
Yeah, brilliant. And how have you found doing the Rottnest Air Taxi job? So if everyone doesn't know, Rottnest is island just to the west of Perth. It's well renowned for its crosswind landings and wind shear with the sand dunes surrounding the airport. If you can land at Rotto, you can pretty much handle anywhere, I reckon.
It's just fabulous. It's the best job. And when I first started, it was kind of frightening. The very first day I went out with Frank and he did some circuits with me out at Rotto. It was probably about a 20-knot crosswind. We were in Cessna 172, and I had never landed a Cessna in that sort of crosswind before. And it was quite stressful. And at the end of that day, I was pretty close to telling Frank that I just wasn't cut out for this and I wasn't a good enough pilot to do the job. But I stuck it out. And for the first few months, it was when I would look at the weather forecast, and if I could see that in 3 or 4 days' time it looked like it was going to be a really nasty, windy day with the wind coming up from the south, 90-degree crosswind, I would just put leave in the calendar for that day. I'd be like, I don't want to work that day. Sea
breeze is your friend.
Yeah. But now I am a much better pilot than I was 6 months ago, 8 months ago. I've been doing this job now for, about 9 months. And the other day, was out there in a Cessna 172 landing in a 28-knot crosswind. And I'm actually pretty proud of myself. I actually think that I'm a pretty good pilot at landing in crosswinds now. And the good thing about this job too is that not only is the crosswinds very challenging and the weather can be fairly extreme, it's also you take off, you cruise for maybe 60 seconds, and then you prepare and you descend and land. So there is no time to just sort of cruise along with the autopilot on and be sort of mindfully, looking around and stuff. It's a 12-minute flight. You are taking off and landing and taking off and landing and taking off and landing. So the hardest parts about flying, you get to practice a lot. So that is really good. The only downside is you don't get to log many hours. You can work all day and log like 3 hours.
Yeah, you look at it against that all.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it is, isn't it? It's just like a big circuit. But I've always said, and again, obviously my bias is coming from Jandakot as well, but West Australia, there's always a wind, a breeze. Like Perth's the third windiest city in the world. There's usually always a breeze. It's certainly something I notice up here in Darwin.
Yeah.
Trying to get a decent crosswind for training and practice is not a lot. So when it does happen, it catches people off guard a bit.
Yeah, yep.
Definitely skill to practice. All right. So we'll move on to that fateful day now.
Yeah.
So the idea was, I guess, heading somewhere you'd already been before up north, but you were going for a fly up to the eclipse at Exmouth, which was the plan. And so you want to take us through that?
Yeah, we couldn't get any accommodation any further north than Geraldton. So we flew to Geraldton, and my oldest son's not really keen on flying. So he drove to Geraldton and met us there, and my youngest son and I flew. And then that morning we departed Geraldton and we went to Carnarvon. We couldn't get to Exmouth really because it was 11:30 in the morning the eclipse happened. So we didn't really have enough daylight to get all the way up there in my little Archer. So we just flew to Carnarvon, and the eclipse there was sort of 96%. So we were like, that's good enough, and it was still pretty cool. The sky went all sort of a dark orange colour, and we had those special solar eclipse glasses so we could see the moon completely, almost completely blocking.
Yeah.
So it was pretty awesome. And so we went up there, watched the eclipse, went into Carnarvon for lunch and came back out, and then hopped in the plane and flew back to Geraldton, where I dropped my oldest son back off again, because so he had come with us in the plane for that part. And then my youngest son and I continued on towards Perth. And the only unusual thing that had happened that day was I had the fuel truck fill me up the night before in Geraldton because I wanted to get away in the morning without having to wait for them. So they filled me up on the Wednesday night. And Thursday morning, I get out to the airport about 8 in the morning and did the usual fuel drain and found that there was a significant amount of water and solid contaminants in the fuel. And when I say significant amount of water, I think in my little drain cup, it was about half to 3/4 of the way full of water and the avgas sitting on the top. And
do you want to just describe for people who haven't seen that before what that looks like?
Yeah, so there's a very clear meniscus. There's a very clear delineation between the water that sits on the bottom and the fuel that sits on the top. And avgas has a blue colouring in it, so you should be able to see that difference between clear water and blue avgas. But to be honest, you don't even really need the colour. It's a very, very clear line that you can see where
it is,
fuel is sitting on top of the water. And I had never, ever seen that before. I'd never even seen any water in fuel ever from any fuel drain I'd ever done. So to have that much water, I was very concerned. So I continued draining both wing.
And your aircraft is in a hangar?
Normally at Jandakot, no, it sits out on the apron, but I had still never seen water in fuel like that, not even after heavy rains. So,
yeah, because sometimes the seals around the fuel caps and things can get it, but if it had been much rain before, I guess it's potentially come from that tanker. Yeah.
Well, it hadn't rained that night, so the water was not there when I departed Jandakot. It hadn't rained, and then it was there the next morning. I know I called the refuelers. They didn't think it had come from their truck, but I think it did because I don't know where else it would have come from. So I, in the POH, it says continue draining until all traces of water and contaminants are gone. And that's pretty much all it says. So I thought, all right, well, I'll just drain all the water out. And I think I had to drain 10 times each wing tank and about 15 times on the gascolator to get all the water out. So there would have been about 600 mils of water, I calculated. Like there was a significant amount. It wasn't just a tiny bit. And so that was pretty disconcerting. I'd never seen that before. It took me a long time to get it all out. And then I kind of thought, okay, well, I've done what it says in the POH. There's not really any other guidance that says I should, get it checked out by an engineer or do anything different. So I thought I'll do the run-ups and see what it sounds like. So I started it up and I ran it up to 2,000 revs. And there was a little cough just at the beginning. And then when I ran it up, I sort of sat on 2,000 revs for a minute or so just to kind of listen and see what it did. And it sounded normal. So I taxied over. Geraldton has a very long runway. I think it's about 2.3 kilometres long, and I only needed like 400 metres to get off the ground in my Archer. So normally I would just sort of taxi out into the middle of the runway at Geraldton and take off. This time I went all the way to the very end. I thought I'm going to use every inch of this runway because there's a chance that if I take off, it might cough and splutter and do something weird and I have to land back on the runway. So I went all the way to the end. So I took off and everything sounded normal and it didn't do anything weird and it didn't sound strange and all the engine indications were normal. And I thought, okay, well, this is so far so good. Flew all the way to Carnarvon, stopped even at Shark Bay because I needed to use the bathroom. So I couldn't quite make it to Carnarvon. So I stopped in a Shark Bay, went to the loo and came back out, took off again and got all the way to Carnarvon completely without incident and then refueled again in Carnarvon. So I had full tanks departing Carnarvon and did another fuel drain and there was a bit of water in the gascolator but I didn't think there was anything in the wing tanks or like a tiny bit, nothing serious. So I got that out and then took off from Carnarvon and got all the way to Fremantle and then stopped in Geraldton to drop my son off and then took off again. Now, that flight from Carnarvon to Jandakot via Geraldton, I've done 4 or 5 times, and I've always done it on one tank of fuel. I've never had to refuel in Geraldton. And I usually have between 50 and 60 litres still in the tanks when I get to the other end. So I knew that I had plenty of fuel to get to my destination. I had quite a strong tailwind coming out of Geraldton. I had about a 20-knot tailwind. It didn't last long, maybe 10 minutes or so, but I didn't have a headwind at all the way home. So I knew that I could get there, and I still, had plenty of fuel. So I switched fuel tanks at about Cervantes, a beam Cervantes, and at that point the gauges said that I had 10 gallons in the left and 12 gallons in the right. And my plane uses about 8 gallons an hour. So, again, plenty of fuel to get all the way back to Jandakot. So I'm cruising along, and I was at just under 2,000 feet. I was at about 1,800. I was sort of on a very slow descent as I was approaching Powerhouse. So I was about 2 miles north of Fremantle when this happened. The first thing that happened was the power just sort of died. I was at about 2,400 revs, and it just sort of went, and just kind of died. And I was just like, whoa, what on earth is going on here? So immediately went mixture full rich, because I was still sort of cruising, and I still had the mixture leaned. So I went mixture full rich, turned on the carb heat, and then it sort of came back to life. It fired back up again. And then I was like, okay, that was weird. Don't know what happened here. And then it did it again. And I was like, oh, wow, okay. So then I was kind of fiddling with the throttle, and then I sort of looked over at the mags and was about to start cycling the mags, and I looked at the altimeter, and I was below 1,500 feet at this stage, about 1,400. And I looked over at Jandakot, and I just thought, oh my God, there's no way I'm going to get over there. Where am I going to go? This isn't, I'd sort of at that stage gone, wow, this is, okay, the engine is not going to come back. This is not going to work out. I have to pick somewhere, and I have to do it quickly. So I look out the window, there's a beach down beside me, and I thought, right, I'll land on the beach. I actually wanted to land on the sand, but there was people everywhere. It was a beautiful evening, really nice sunset, all these people picnics, and I was like, oh, no, that's not going to work. So,
and I think that's a big point to make, because everyone that watches these ditching videos always goes, why don't they just land on the beach?
I know.
I said, well, yes, would have been great, but clearly you don't want to take anyone out.
And, there's some people that will see something like this happening, and they'll literally just stand there with their mouth open and stare at you as you're plummeting towards them with the propeller still.
Won't even get out of the way.
There was no way I was going to attempt to land on the beach. Absolutely no way. So, and the wind had been coming from behind me. So I had to do a 180 to turn around and face into the wind. And, ditching is one of those things that you kind of learn the theory about, but you obviously never get to practice it. So I'd done plenty of PFLs and had that sort of PFL checklist in my head. And there was a mistake that I made there that I'll talk about in a second when we sort of go through the learnings from this. But you don't ever get to practice a water ditching. So I knew that the best way to do it was, if possible, to face into the wind and to land along the crest of a wave, which you don't usually get the combination of those things. But when you're close to the shore, you can. So I turned the aircraft around, I faced it into the wind, I got as close to the shore as possible without getting anywhere near people. And there were people in the water swimming as well. So I was trying to very hard to stay in a position where I wasn't going to hit anyone, but where I could swim to shore and we weren't going to be too far out. I had adopted the glide attitude pretty much straight away when it first started to falter. That was the first thing that I did. And as I was turning through that 180 degrees, I looked at the altimeter, and by this stage I'm at 500 feet. And I thought, oh my goodness, I haven't even made a mayday call yet. So I made a very hasty mayday call to Perth Centre. I'm pretty sure they've never heard anyone talk that fast in their life, but made my mayday call, and then just looked out the window, positioned the aircraft in the best sort of place that I thought, and then got down sort of as slow as I could, and then the stall warning was going off, so I knew that I was super slow. By this stage I was only maybe 20 feet above the water when the stall warning was going off, so I knew I was going as slow as I could. And then as I sort of flared, I just held the nose up as high as possible and just tried to hit sort of tail first and main wheels and not let that nose wheel go down, because I didn't want the nose to hit the water and flip me over. That was the main concern for me, was to not let the plane flip over. So it was interesting when you did the interview with Lynn, and she was saying that in a fixed tricycle undercarriage you're supposed to land all 3 wheels like flat. And that's not what I did. And I don't know whether the outcome would have been any different or whether that was a better way to do it, but this seemed to work for me. As I sort of got the main wheels down on the water, we skidded along the water for probably 2 or 3 seconds, and I thought, wow, this is going well. Wow, cool. And then the right wing stalled and sort of dug down into the water, and then we stopped quite suddenly, and it sort of flipped us around a little bit horizontally, sort of spun us about. So my son, as we had been sort of coming down to land on the water, he had said to me, Mum, do you want me to hold the door open? Do you want me to open the door? And I was like, oh, yes, I do need you to open the door, mate. And I kind of hadn't sort of got to that point yet. That's obviously in the PFL checklist, doing the passenger brief and talking about the door and all the rest of it. But I sort of, because this happened at such low altitude, I just didn't get all the way through the list. I just kind of got part way and then went, oh, my God, I've got to focus on what's most important.
You've got to prioritise.
Aviate, navigate, communicate, right? I was doing the aviate bit.
Yeah.
He was brilliant. He didn't, he was so calm. He just opened the door. There's a latch up the top and there's one down the bottom. He's got both of them open. He's holding the door open and he's 6'2". He's a big lad. So he was really, strong and able to hold the door open. And as we landed on the water started coming in, but quite slowly. It wasn't frightening at all. It didn't sort of gush in. It just sort of slowly came in through the floor vents first. And we just popped the door open and popped out. And just stood there on the wing and just kind of looked at each other like, wow, I can't believe that just happened. And at that stage, by the time I got out on the wing, I just kind of froze. I just kind of stood there and like a deer in the headlights. I just was like, oh my God, now what? And he said to me, Mum, what should we do? And I said, oh, maybe we should get our phones. But I wasn't moving. I was just kind of standing there staring at my phone going underwater. So he launched back into the cockpit, grabbed my phone, grabbed his phone, jumped back out again, and we're standing there. And I reckon it took probably 4 or 5 minutes for the plane to sink to the point where the cabin was underwater. Like, it took quite a while. It wasn't rapid. And we were in about 2.5, 3 meters of water. And I know that because when I got out on the beach and she'd sunk down to the point where she was sitting on the bottom, the top of the fin was still sticking out of the water. And I had forgotten to switch off the master switch, right? I'd forgotten all the shutdown checks. So I just jumped out. And so the was still going, and it was like she was sitting there under the water and the beacon's flashing and she's going, help me. Yeah. So people swam out to sort of help us and say, you're okay, do you need some assistance? And we just sort of hopped in the water and swam to shore. It's quite difficult to swim with shoes on. That was a bit of a challenge, but it wasn't far. It was maybe 20 or 30 meters, So we swam to shore and hopped out and just kind of watched her slowly sink, because by then she still hadn't gotten to the point where she was sitting on the bottom. So it did take quite a while.
Yeah.
But yeah, completely unscathed, not even a bump on either of us. We didn't hit our heads on the dash. We did not even a scratch, nothing, not a bruise. I thought the next day that I might have a sore neck, I might have a bit of whiplash, but I didn't. I was absolutely fine. So that was that. Yeah.
Well done.
Yeah.
No, well done. Like, if you haven't seen the video, I'll post a link to it. But it's, it was very impressive. And yeah, look, I did think the similar thing, that typically you'd store the tail in first, because as we know, there can be 2 impacts. First is the undercarriage hitting the water, and then because of the higher CG, the tail's going to want to go over tit. So it's basically going to want to flip, and then the nose is going to impact the water as a secondary thing. But yeah, yours seemed to have a couple of sort of skips and then it kind of settled. And like you said, just that little dip at the end, but kept all upright and it was fantastic. I know there's a 152 or 150 or something in America that did it, and that landed very flat. Yeah. And that did flip. Yeah. So I think getting the tail in, stalling it as slow as you can, is definitely the trick.
Yeah, it worked remarkably well, and that that was just me trying to think through, okay, well, what's the best way to do this? Just kind of making it up as I went along. But I had so many people contact me afterwards complimenting me on my landing and what an amazing job I did. It was awesome. And some pilots were contacting me on, Facebook and stuff and saying, oh, the way that you didn't use flap, and the way that you touched down and then you used you touched down on the left main wheel first and then the right one, and then you used the right wing to slow you down, and you made sure the propeller stopped perfectly horizontal. And I just read it and just laughed and thought, I didn't do any of that.
No. I know. There's always this focus on stopping propellers, so that if people understand where the top dead center point is, or where a propeller is actually going to come to rest, it's going to stop where it's going to stop. Yeah. And you can't just let it hit the ground. Yeah. Or the water in this case. Yeah. Yes. No, look, we're really well done on the technique. And I think, I'm sure Trish and Min would have been very, very proud.
Yeah. Yeah. They were just grateful that I was okay.
Well, and that's it. And that's why we do the training, is so you go home. It's not about the aeroplane. Aeroplanes can be replaced.
That's it. Yeah.
But regardless of how unique and special it is,
Yeah.
You're the reason.
I got my insurance payout yesterday, so that's great. And now I can buy another plane, and that's fine. But I was really, really attached to this plane. This plane was like a member of my family. I'd had her for a year. We'd had all these fun adventures in her, and I called her Faye. Her call sign was Foxtrot Echo Yankee, so her name was Faye.
A natural name, yeah.
Yeah, and when I realised that this was an engine failure scenario and that I was going to have to land on the beach or in the water, the only thing going through my head was, poor Faye. Faye's not going to survive this. And it's. I know that sounds terrible. My 15-year-old son sitting beside me, I wasn't worried about him. I wasn't even worried about me. I was just worried about Faye.
Well, hopefully he's not listening to this and doesn't just realise that for the first time. He knows. All right. So let's go through the concept of, at the time the failure happened, and we talk about this, concept of a bit of startle and surprise, and whether people are going to freeze in the face of danger and emergency or spring into action. What do you think your experience was there?
I definitely sprung into action. There was definitely no freezing until I got out of the plane. After it was all over, I then
job's done.
I then hopped out and stood on the wing and just stood there like a stunned mullet. Watched my iPad go underwater. Could have easily grabbed it. Now, of course, I don't have an iPad, and that's very upsetting. Could have grabbed it. Could have grabbed my Bose headset. Could have got a whole heap of stuff out and saved it. But I just stood there and stared at it all and watched it go underwater. Anyway, so I definitely launched straight into action. I was immediately like, right, okay, launch into the PFL checklist. This is what we do, It took me about, I reckon, 20 to 30 seconds of just mucking around, I went mixture full rich carb heat on, and then I sort of played with the throttle and looked out the window, and I mucked around for probably 20 seconds, just sort of going, oh, why is this happening? This can't be happening.
Yeah.
But, I had, I think, less than 2 minutes from the time the engine started to falter until I hit the water. So I really did not have any time to just sit there and think about what I was going to do next. It was very, very quick.
And did you change tanks or fuel pumps and things, did you get?
Yeah, so there's some, for me, there's kind of 3 fairly key learnings from this that I wanted to share in this podcast. 3 things that I think are pretty important for people. And the first learning for me was the mnemonics for the checklists, right? So we've got so many mnemonics, your bumfish and puff and all these checks that we do, right? And the mnemonic for the PFL troubleshooting checks is FCMIT. And FCMIT is fuel, carb heat, mixture, ignition, throttle. And I didn't do that. And I when I got home after the plane landed in the water and we got back here and I got into bed, and as soon as my head hit the pillow, the very first thing that popped into my head was, oh, my God, I didn't switch the fuel tanks. Why did I not do that? I actually think there's probably an 80% chance I could have saved it had I switched fuel tanks at the time that it started to falter, before the engine cut out. I actually think that I could have saved it. And I'll talk about the ATSB findings in a second and what they found, and it is fuel-related. So I kicked myself and was like, why did I not do that? That is just such an obvious thing to do. Why did I not do it? And I think the reason is because when I learnt PFLs, I learnt them in a Cessna 172. And when you're in a Cessna 172, the fuel selector and the fuel shutoff valve is down on the floor in the middle between the seats, right? And so you start down there. So you start at fuel and then you work your way up and you go carb, heated, mixture and ignition, they're all in the middle. And carb, heat, mixture and throttle, they're all in the middle, and you go across to ignition. And so it's not quite FCMIT, but it's pretty much. And I had this thing where rather than trying to memorize all the mnemonics, I tried to memorize the flow. Okay, we start here and we work our way up logically. We go here, 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 here. So I had this logical flow of where I would start and where it would finish. And that's fine in a Cessna 172, but I was in a Piper, and the fuel selector in a Piper is on the floor on the left-hand side against the wall over on the other side. So I started in the middle, just like I always did in Cessna, but that's not where the fuel is. And I think that's why I didn't do that. So because I've started in the middle and we've been systematically working my way across, I got to the ignition part. I looked out the window. I realised I was at almost 1,000 feet and I still had to turn around and I still had to work out where I was going to go. And I just abandoned that part of the checklist because all I could think about then was, where am I going to land? So I never got to the point where I switched fuel tanks, and it makes me so angry because I think, man, I could have potentially saved that. So the biggest learning for me is the mnemonics are written that way for a reason. FCMIT starts with F because if you have an engine failure, one of the most likely scenarios is that it's fuel related. And if you're in a low wing aircraft and you want to switch from one tank to the other, there's a fair chance that you will fix the problem, So that's the biggest one.
And you're also in a left tank, right tank scenario, aren't you? Whereas a Cessna is both. So
exactly.
This is that whole thing of just going fuel on, carb heat mixture. But hang on, where is the fuel? And maybe let's try left tank. Let's try right tank. And this is where that flow is potentially gone against you as well, where we need to physically push, pull, switch, whatever it is.
Yeah, it really has. And in a low wing aircraft, that fuel selector is so much more critical than in a Cessna or in a high wing aircraft where you've got gravity flow through both tanks. I was on the right tank when this occurred, and the ATSB findings, there was an issue in that right tank that potentially has contributed to this. Had I switched to the left tank, possibly, and I definitely still had plenty of fuel in the left tank. I had about another hour's worth of cruise. I had about 10 gallons in that left tank. So definitely
35 litres or so.
Yeah, definitely but definitely had enough fuel, but didn't switch to the left tank. And so, I think for me, the biggest learning there was follow the mnemonic the way that it is structured, because it's structured that way for a reason. And FCMIT starts with fuel. So if this ever happens to me again, trust me, the fuel selector is the first thing I'll be reaching for.
Yeah.
The second kind of learning that I have from this after reflecting on it now for a couple of months is I read an interview not long ago that showed the relationship between the number of hours that a pilot has flying in command versus the risk of you being in a serious incident or a fatal accident. And it looks kind of like a bell curve. So it starts low, goes up high, and then goes round and back down. And it starts low because when you first learn to fly, you're with an instructor, you're very conscientious, you're learning all this new stuff, so you're really careful, right? And even when you first get your private pilot license, you're very, very conscientious. And I was extremely conscientious. I filled out everything, that you needed to in the log, used every checklist, used everything to the letter of the law, and was very, very conscientious about the way that I prepared for and the way that I flew. And then when you get to about somewhere between 300 and 500 hours, you're at the top of that curve. You're at the maximum risk of having a serious incident or fatality. And it's because complacency starts to creep in. You kind of get to that point where you start to think, I'm pretty good at this. I've been flying for a few hundred hours now. I've got this under control. And you just naturally relax on all that stuff. And you're not necessarily doing things that are risky or illegal, but you're just not concentrating and dotting every I and crossing every T like you used to. You're just getting a bit more complacent. And then, of course, it goes down at the end when you've got thousands of hours, because by then you've got so much life experience and so much experience with things going wrong that you kind of know how to get out of it and what to do differently. So I was kind of at that maximum point. And if I think back on that flight, I was being a bit complacent. I was listening to my son. We were having a chat about something. We were listening to some music. It was a beautiful afternoon. The sun was going down. It was all lovely. And I was kind of looking out the window and just enjoying life. And was I hyper-focused on the fuel gauges and where I was at and when I needed to switch tanks? No, I wasn't. And was I hyper-focused on the engine gauges and whether my temperatures and pressures were green and everything else? No, I wasn't. And I kind of every 15, 20 minutes, I look at those things as part of my usual scans and my usual checks. But if I think back on it now, I remember what was in the tanks when I switched at a Beam Cervantes, but I actually don't remember after that, when I looked at it, what was going on in those fuel tanks. So just that sort of level of complacency where you kind of just get a bit too comfortable with what's going on. And it's unfortunate that it's taken this sort of incident to snap me back into line. But now I think I'm a much better pilot. Now when I fly, I'm hyper-focused on the gauges, the T's and P's, the fuel levels, which tank I'm on, when I need to switch. I'm back in that sort of newly PPL for really, really conscientious phase where I'm just looking at everything constantly, and I'm constantly looking out the window and going, if it happened here, where am I going to go? What am I going to do? So I'm great now, but it's a real shame that it took that to happen to snap me out of that sort of complacency I was starting to get into.
Yeah, it's not being negative Nancy or being pessimistic either. It's just being safe. And this is why we do these things, because I've got 5 hours in the tanks. It's a 2-hour flight. Like, why do I need to do a fuel log? I get this all the time.
Yep.
But how do you pick up that the gauges are working, not working? The fuel that's in there is what you expect. That's how we detect leaks or fuel flow issues or venting issues, over temping, anything else. This is what it's all about. So it doesn't matter whether it's the first time or the 100th time you've done that flight.
Exactly.
You need to just keep an eye on these things. It's just very basic diligence. This is why there's so many fuel starvation / exhaustion issues. It's still something we need to keep talking about.
Yeah, exactly. So they're kind of the two main things for me. And then the third learning is probably just about the skills and the knowledge and the training and just keeping up. I often read ATSB incident investigation reports and try and understand, what happened, why did it happen, how did that go wrong. I watch the Av Safety podcast that that CASA put out. I listen to podcasts. I try and soak up as much as I can and talk to pilots all the time about, when things have gone wrong for them and what they've done. And all of that knowledge, this is why I'm alive. This is why my son's alive and we live to tell the tale, because,
Absolutely.
Reporters at the time asked me, do you think you're really lucky? You're so lucky that you lived. And I was like, well, no, I think 20% of it was luck and 80% of it was because I'm actually a really good pilot. I've got the skills. I've trained really hard for this. I've worked very hard to make sure that I'm a good pilot. And that's what got me out of it. The 20% luck was in where it occurred. I was very lucky that I had somewhere to go. 2 minutes later, I would have been over the suburbs and, just going, whoa, where am I going to go now? And I thought at the time, if I had been over the suburbs, maybe I would land on the Kwinana Freeway. And since then, I've flown over that freeway so many times and I look down and
there's no chance.
There is signs and bridges and lights and stuff everywhere on that road. There's not a chance. So, yeah, if I had been over a heavily populated area with nowhere to go, it would have been really quite catastrophic. So the luck part is where it happened. But the other 80%, the other reason that we're still here is because all the training and all the skills and all the knowledge and all the things that I learnt and memorised and obviously one of them I didn't memorise as well as I should have, but the rest of it is why we were able to get out of that and to do so well with the landing. So making sure that as a pilot you continually are learning and picking up new things and talking to people and trying to glean as much as you can from all the av safety stuff and the podcasts and the incident reports and just trying to learn as much as possible so that if something does go wrong, you've got as much knowledge as you need to get out of it.
Yeah, the learning never stops, does it? It doesn't matter whether you're a 100-hour pilot or a 10,000-hour pilot. There is always something new to learn, even if it's just change in systems and equipment and procedures and things, but there's always something. So well done.
Thanks. Thank you. And so the ATSB, unfortunately, it took them about a week to decide whether or not to investigate this incident. And that was a bit of a shame because when the aircraft was first pulled out of the water, the wing tanks were drained and the wings were taken off. And when the wing tanks were drained, we sort of lost that opportunity to see how much fuel was in each of those tanks. Now, I think there was still about 15 litres in that right tank, which is the tank that was selected at the time. Which is still enough, 15 litres of usable fuel in that right tank. So I don't think that fuel starvation because of a lack of fuel was the issue. But the ATSB investigation has come up with two possible hypotheses, and that's one of them because unfortunately there's no way to prove that wasn't the case, that I did have enough fuel in there. But the second hypothesis that they've come up with, and the investigator did an amazing job. He was so thorough and tracked down every lead and did really, really quite an extraordinary job of the investigation. The other hypothesis is that some either water or solid contaminants have prevented fuel from getting into the engine and that's why it's cut out. So he did find that in the right tank there was a filter missing off the fuel pickup. And when he got in and had a look, it was because the fuel pickup had been replaced with a non-standard part that never had a filter in the first place. So that then allowed solid material potentially to get down into the fuel lines and block them up. Now, he checked all the fuel lines and he couldn't find a blockage in there. So was it the case? Was it not? I don't know. It spent 24 hours rolling around in the surf underwater and, had an octopus in the tail cone by the time they pulled. So
made a home already.
Yeah. So I don't know whether that had potentially contributed, whether the fuel had somehow suffered a blockage and then was potentially dislodged. He does think it's possible that water got into the engine and that the water has caused it to cut out. So it was something to do with fuel quality or quantity is the reason why the engine cut out. There was nothing else wrong with the engine. It was in perfectly good working order. Mechanically, everything was sound. It was all still working and turning and, he went through everything with a fine-tooth comb. So definitely a fuel issue and I think a fuel contamination issue, a fuel quality issue. And that's it, it's sort of that's a bit scary because then it's like, well, what should I have done differently there? Should I have not taken off from Geraldton? Should I have fully drained the tanks and started again? And I don't know. I don't have an answer for that, but that's definitely a scary prospect that's potentially why it occurred, given the amount of time I spent trying to get all that stuff out of the tanks before I departed.
Yeah. Look, we had a 172 in the wet season up here, and we did, same thing, nearly got 10 screwdriver fuel samples out of it. And the first drain, you'd almost would think, yep, it's fine. But then you realize, actually, this is 100% water.
Yeah.
And the meniscus thing is one of the clues that if you look at a water meniscus, like if you fill your glass with water, a meniscus will bubble up, whereas avgas bubbles down.
Yeah.
So the meniscus actually sinks into the fluid rather than bubble up.
Yeah.
And that's one way to identify it as well.
Yeah.
But draining it and keep draining it, maybe giving the wing a wiggle, allowing it time to settle. Because, again, for everyone listening, of course, that's why the fuel drain points are where they are. They're not at random points. They're at supposedly the lowest point of the tank so that any sediment and water will settle there. So I don't think there's anything you did wrong there at all. I think it's just one of those things that might have been a domino effect of something else.
Yeah.
Do you know if the fuel at Carnarvon or Geraldton was tested at all as part of the investigation?
Yeah, so as part of the investigation, they contacted the refuelers at Geraldton, and they didn't think that there was any issue. They had done checks of their facility and thought that there was no water in that fuel that came out of the truck. As I said, it wasn't there when I departed Jandakot, and it hadn't rained. And so they also reviewed the CCTV footage to see whether someone had potentially interfered with my aircraft overnight. Now, I don't know anyone in Geraldton who hates me, so I'm kind of hoping that no one's trying to. But fortunately, by the time he requested that footage, it had expired, and so he didn't get to see what had happened overnight there. So there was a few sort of issues with timing of the investigation. But yeah, it's a bit of a mystery. It's a bit it's unfortunate that there was no definitive answer from the investigation. And he did say to me, he said, look, this is quite common. Often we do not have an answer where we go, aha, that's exactly what happened. Often we will end up in a situation where we have a number of hypotheses, and it could have been this and it could have been that. And unfortunately, this is one of those.
Yeah, without sort of the high-tech black boxes and data recorders and things, it is very much, like you say, hats off to them, because I think the amount of information and detail they do get to in some of these reports for a light aircraft that doesn't have all that data is quite phenomenal. But at the end of the day, like you say, you've survived, your training kicked in, you've done a fantastic job, and you're now so graciously sharing that experience with everyone else to even increase the learning, which I'm really grateful for you for joining us. That's great.
Yeah, no worries.
Fantastic. All right, is there anything else you wanted to add before we wrap up?
No, I don't think so. I think it's just that keep an eye on your fuel levels and remember FC Met.
Yeah, no, that's it. All right, Michelle. Well, look, thank you so much for sharing. And are you? I guess I've got my quiz, and I guess I might adapt it to yours situation a little bit. So, given that you got your insurance payout, your favourite aircraft you've flown, and is there another one on the horizon that you've got your eye on? Do you think you'll buy again?
Yeah, interesting question. So in my job with Rottnest Air Taxi, I fly Cherokee 6s, and I love Cherokee 6s. I just think they are such a great aircraft. They're so easy to fly and land, and they're just so stable, and they're beautiful aircraft to fly. So I do love a Cherokee 6. I loved my little Archer, but unfortunately it was just a bit too slow. I really want something that goes a bit faster,
No, fixed pitch prop.
Yeah, I've sort of graduated from flying a plane that does kind of 100, 110 knots. I really want to fly something faster now. So I'm looking at some of the RVs. There's a Syndicate with an RV 14A that I'm having a bit of a look at the moment, because that's a beautiful aircraft. I went for flying that the other day, and it was awesome. We were doing a ground speed of 185 knots. So
brilliant.
A little Archer. So potentially something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, getting into that 3 mile a minute bracket definitely makes a difference.
Yeah.
So, all right. And if you had your choice of anything, what would be your favourite aircraft you'd love to fly?
Oh, you know what? I was in the My Jet Life lottery, and I was really hoping today I'd get a new SR-22 Cirrus.
Has that been drawn yet? I think that's coming up, isn't it? Very soon.
I think it was drawn a couple of hours ago, and they haven't called me, so I'm guessing that perhaps I didn't win.
So, or maybe I'm blocking your phone.
Yeah.
Wrap up.
I realise I'm a proud owner of a new SR-22.
All right. And what about your favourite sort of type of flying that you love to do?
Yeah, I actually am quite enjoying flying down here in the winter at the moment, the storms and the wind, and it's providing some really challenging conditions. And a couple of weeks ago, I flew every day with Rottnest Air Taxi, and every day there was some different thing that I had to get around, some storm shower, some showers or a storm or winds or, something that really made me think about, okay, how are we going to do this and what's the best way to get there with that being in the way or that has that scenario. So I'm actually quite enjoying flying in very challenging weather conditions at the moment because it's really stretching me and I think making me a better pilot than when you fly when it's just this beautiful sunny day and there's no wind.
Yeah, I'll come for when you get your new aircraft. Come up for a venture in the wet season up here. You'll love it.
Yeah,
the adrenaline junkie. All right, and so the last one to wrap up, your favourite aviation movie.
Oh, look, I know it's a massive cliche, but I really loved Top Gun Maverick.
Everyone does. It's got all the chemical formulas of a hit, doesn't it?
Yeah, I thought it was great. And when it first came out, I thought, oh, I bet this will be really cliche. I bet this will be really lame. But I actually loved it.
Yeah. No, well, look, it smashed records, so we're not alone.
Yeah. Tom Cruise is awesome. I just think he's great.
Yeah, he's pretty crazy. He gets the F-51. We're all jealous. All right, Michelle, look, thank you again for joining us. Really, really appreciate it. Look, if anyone wants to get to Rottnest, you know where to find find it. Go hit up her and Frank at Rottnest Air Taxi. All right, Michelle, take care.
I've had a few passengers say to me, oh, we're so glad you're flying us over to Rotto because if we have an engine failure on the way, you know what to do.
Yeah, well, you're more qualified than me. So.
Thank you so much.
All the best. All right.
Great to be part of your show. And I love your podcast. Listen to it all the time. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm glad you're enjoying it. All right. Well, take care. Thanks for your time.
Okay. See ya.
Thank you so much again to Michelle for that episode and sharing her story. It's still an interim ATSB report, but the full report will come out eventually. But I will post the link to the video of the landing or the ditching and also to the current progress of the ATSB report. So if you want to keep an eye on that one later on, once the full report comes out, you can do so. All right, so I hope you got something out of that. It's, like I said, it's something that can happen anywhere, anytime, and we all need to be prepared. It's not about being pessimistic about things. It's just giving yourself options and just making sure you stay proficient. This is what all these checks and flight test checks and the training is all about. And the further you are from that training, remember, the more at risk you are of getting complacent and, making a mistake that otherwise would not have happened. All right, guys. Well, I'm off to hit the books, finish up a few flights, and then into ground school next week. I will let you know all about it and how it's going as things happen. And stay tuned for some more fantastic episodes. As always, you can get hold of me at info@TrentRobinsonAviation.com.au. Thank you to all my Patreon subscribers. I've had a couple of new people join the last few weeks. Is Arthur, Andrew, John, and Sarah. Thank you for your contributions. Until next week, blue skies, and remember the golden rule. Aviate, navigate, communicate. See ya.